The flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the basement, illuminating a scene that would shatter a family and captivate a nation for 3 decades. John Ramsey's legs buckled as he saw his daughter lying on the cold concrete floor, a white blanket partially covering her small body, her blonde hair matted, her lips blue. It was December 26, 1996, approximately 1 in the afternoon, and the frantic search for 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey had just ended in the most horrific way imaginable. Hours earlier, Patsy Ramsey had discovered a ransom note on the spiral staircase of their Boulder mansion, 2.5 pages written on paper from a notepad inside their own home, demanding $118,000 for the safe return of their daughter. The 911 call came at 5:52 in the morning, Patsy's voice cracking with panic as she told the dispatcher her daughter had been kidnapped. But no kidnapper had taken JonBenét anywhere. She had been in the basement the entire time, murdered in her own home while her family slept upstairs, or so the official timeline suggested. What really happened during those dark hours between Christmas night and dawn? Who could commit such an unspeakable act against a child in a house where her parents and 9-year-old brother were supposedly sleeping? Why would someone write a rambling ransom note for a child who was already dead or dying in the basement? These questions would launch one of the most controversial murder investigations in American history, a case that would divide public opinion, destroy reputations, spawn countless theories, and remain unsolved as the calendar turns to 2026, exactly 30 years after that terrible morning. The evidence left behind was simultaneously abundant and maddeningly contradictory, pointing fingers in every direction while providing definitive answers in none. DNA found on the victim's clothing matched no one in the family, no one in any database, no one who has ever been identified despite decades of testing and retesting. Fibers from Patsy's jacket were found on the duct tape that covered JonBenét's mouth. A practice ransom note was discovered in the same notepad, suggesting someone had written a draft before composing the final version. The paintbrush used to construct the garrote that strangled JonBenét came from Patsy's art supplies. A bowl of pineapple sat on the kitchen table with fingerprints from Patsy and Burke. Yet no one admitted to feeding JonBenét that night, even though undigested pineapple was found in her stomach. How could so much evidence exist and yet lead nowhere? How could investigators work this case for 3 decades without reaching a conclusion? What secrets might still be buried in the evidence, waiting for the right technology or the right question to finally reveal the truth? The Ramsey home at 755 15th Street was not just a house, but a sprawling 15-room Tudor mansion that spoke of success, wealth, and the American dream realized through hard work and ambition. John Ramsey had built Access Graphics into a billion-dollar computer distribution company, rising from poverty to prosperity through intelligence and determination. Patsy Ramsey, a former Miss West Virginia who had graduated from West Virginia University, had channeled her pageant experience into nurturing JonBenét's own participation in child beauty pageants, a decision that would later be scrutinized and criticized by millions who saw those images of a 6-year-old in makeup and costumes as deeply troubling. But those who knew the Ramseys painted a picture of a loving, close-knit family that enjoyed their success while remaining grounded in their faith and community. Christmas 1996 had been filled with celebration, gift opening, family time, and a party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends of the Ramseys who would later become estranged from the family, under circumstances that added another layer of mystery to an already complex case. The family had returned home around 9 or 10 that evening, the children tired from the excitement of the day, everyone preparing for an early flight the next morning to their vacation home in Michigan, where they planned to celebrate the holidays with John's older children from his previous marriage. JonBenét had been put to bed in her room on the 2nd floor, dressed in her pajamas, presumably asleep within minutes of her head hitting the pillow. Burke, her 9-year-old brother, had also gone to his room, and by all accounts, the house had settled into the quiet stillness of a sleeping family on the night after Christmas. But somewhere in those dark hours, something went terribly wrong. Someone entered JonBenét's room, either waking her or taking her while she slept, bringing her down to the basement where she would suffer a violent death that included both a massive skull fracture and strangulation. The medical examiner determined she had been struck on the head with tremendous force, causing a fracture that extended across her skull and produced brain swelling that would have been fatal on its own. But she did not die immediately from the head wound. Evidence suggested she lived for 45 minutes to 2 hours after being struck, though likely unconscious from the massive trauma. During that time, someone fashioned a garrote from white cord and the broken handle of one of Patsy's paintbrushes, a crude strangling device that was twisted around JonBenét's neck, cutting off her air supply and eventually ending her life. The autopsy also revealed evidence that some experts interpreted as sexual assault, though this remained one of the many points of bitter disagreement among forensic specialists who examined the case. The crime scene was compromised from the very beginning in ways that would haunt the investigation for decades and provide ammunition for every conspiracy theory imaginable. When Boulder police responded to the kidnapping call that morning, they treated it as exactly that, a kidnapping, not securing the house as a potential crime scene or limiting access to potential evidence. Friends and family arrived to support the Ramseys, moving through the house, touching surfaces, potentially contaminating evidence without any malicious intent, but with devastating consequences for the investigation. The Ramseys' pastor came, friends brought food, people gathered in the kitchen, in the living room, in various parts of the house that should have been completely secured if police had recognized this as something other than a straightforward kidnapping case. Detective Linda Arndt was left alone in the house with multiple civilians, a situation that violated every protocol for handling a potential crime scene, but reflected the confusion and lack of experience that plagued the early hours of the investigation. Around 1 p.m, Detective Arndt suggested that John Ramsey and Fleet White search the house again to see if they could find anything unusual. Within minutes, John Ramsey was screaming from the basement. He had found JonBenét in a small room that some called the wine cellar, though it was really just a storage space in the basement that was rarely used. Her body was lying on the floor, rigor mortis already setting in, indicating she had been dead for hours. John Ramsey picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs, a completely understandable reaction from a father finding his murdered child, but an action that further contaminated the crime scene and made forensic analysis more difficult. Detective Arndt would later testify about the moment when she made eye contact with John Ramsey after he brought JonBenét upstairs, a moment where her training kicked in and she felt the situation was dangerous, though she could never fully articulate why or what specifically triggered that instinct. She counted the people in the house and realized she was outnumbered if something went wrong. She placed her hand on her weapon and kept it there, a detail that would later be interpreted by some as evidence that even the detective on scene suspected something was wrong with the family's story, while others saw it as simply a trained officer assessing a chaotic situation where control had been completely lost. The ransom note became the single most analyzed piece of evidence in the entire case, scrutinized by handwriting experts, linguists, psychologists, and armchair detectives who parsed every word looking for clues about who wrote it and why. The note was written on a pad of paper found in the Ramsey home, using a black felt-tip pen that belonged to Patsy and was found placed back in the pen cup on the counter. The author had started and discarded an earlier version on the same pad, a practice note that began with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey before being crossed out and abandoned. The final version addressed only John Ramsey and was written in a style that seemed simultaneously theatrical and amateurish, referencing movies like Speed and Dirty Harry, claiming to represent a small foreign faction, and warning against contacting police or friends with threats that the two gentlemen watching over your daughter would kill her if instructions were not followed precisely. The ransom amount was oddly specific at $118,000, a figure that happened to match almost exactly the amount of John Ramsey's recent bonus from his company. Information that would presumably only be known to someone close to the family or someone who had access to their financial documents. The note provided elaborate instructions for the ransom delivery, including specific times and locations, details that would become meaningless once JonBenét's body was discovered, but that suggested the author had put significant thought into constructing a believable kidnapping scenario. What kidnapper breaks into a home, commits a murder, but then sits down at the kitchen table to write a 2.5-page ransom note using materials from inside the house? What kidnapper practices their note, makes a mistake, discards it, and starts over? What kidnapper takes the time to put the pen and pad back where they found them? These questions led many investigators to conclude the note was written by someone who lived in the house, someone who had time to construct this elaborate fiction because they were not actually fleeing the scene of a crime. Multiple handwriting analysts examined the note and compared it to writing samples from both Patsy and John Ramsey. Some analysts concluded that Patsy could not be eliminated as the author of the note, pointing to similarities in certain letter formations and word choices. Other analysts concluded definitively that Patsy did not write the note, that the similarities were superficial and the differences were significant enough to exclude her. The disagreement among experts only added to the confusion and allowed both sides of the public debate to claim vindication for their preferred theory. The Boulder Police Department found themselves suddenly thrust into the international spotlight with a case that exceeded their experience and resources in almost every way. Boulder was a college town, relatively quiet, relatively safe, a place where murders were rare and murders of children in their own homes were essentially unheard of. The police department had limited experience with major homicide investigations and no experience whatsoever with a case that would generate the kind of media attention and public scrutiny that descended upon them within days of JonBenét's murder. From the beginning, the investigation was marked by tension between the police department and the district attorney's office, disagreements about strategy and about who should be considered suspects and about whether there was sufficient evidence to pursue charges against anyone. The police focused their investigation almost exclusively on the Ramsey family, operating under the statistical reality that most children who are murdered are killed by someone in their immediate family, usually a parent. This focus led them to view every piece of evidence through the lens of family guilt, interpreting ambiguous details in ways that supported their theory while potentially overlooking evidence that might point to an intruder. The Ramseys, meanwhile, hired experienced criminal defense attorneys almost immediately, a move that was both completely understandable, given that they were clearly being viewed as suspects, and also deeply damaging to their public image because it made them appear uncooperative and guilty in the eyes of many observers. The relationship between the Ramsey family and the Boulder Police Department deteriorated rapidly, marked by disputes about interview conditions, about access to evidence, about the pace and direction of the investigation, creating an adversarial dynamic that made it increasingly difficult for investigators to pursue the case effectively. The media circus that erupted around the investigation was unprecedented in its intensity and its intrusiveness. Television news trucks lined the streets around the Ramsey home and around the Boulder Police Department. Tabloids offered enormous sums of money for insider information, creating incentives for leaks that compromised the investigation and revealed details that should have been kept confidential. Talk shows devoted hours to discussing the case, inviting experts and non-experts alike to speculate about what happened and who was responsible, creating a constant stream of theories and accusations that may or may not have had any basis in actual evidence. Burke Ramsey, only 9 years old when his sister was murdered, found himself at the center of speculation and rumor that would follow him throughout his childhood and into adulthood, accusations so damaging and so persistent that he would eventually file defamation lawsuits against media organizations that suggested he might have been involved in JonBenét's death. The theories about Burke ranged from accidental injury during a sibling argument that escalated to something tragic, with parents then covering up what happened to protect their surviving child, to more sinister scenarios that most experts in child psychology considered highly unlikely, if not impossible, given Burke's age and what is known about child development. The Boulder police interviewed Burke multiple times in the days and weeks after the murder, always in the presence of attorneys and child psychologists, trying to understand what he might have seen or heard that night. Burke consistently maintained that he had been asleep the entire night, that he heard nothing unusual, that he had no knowledge of what happened to his sister until his parents told him the next day. His affect during these interviews, his manner of speaking, his reactions to questions, all became subjects of intense analysis and debate. Some observers found his demeanor strange or inappropriate, noting that he did not seem as emotional or as devastated as they would expect from a 9-year-old who had just lost his sister. Child psychology experts cautioned strongly against reading too much into how a traumatized child presents, noting that children process grief and trauma differently than adults, and that there is no correct way for a child to behave in such circumstances. Some children shut down emotionally as a protective mechanism. Some retreat into routines and normalcy because they cannot process the enormity of what has happened. Some appear strangely calm because they do not yet fully understand the permanence of death. But these expert cautions did little to stop the speculation and the rumors that circulated online and in tabloids, rumors that would haunt Burke for decades. In 1999, a grand jury heard evidence in the case for 13 months, examining forensic reports, listening to testimony from investigators and experts, trying to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to bring charges against anyone in the JonBenét Ramsey murder. The grand jury proceedings were secret, as such proceedings always are, and when they concluded in October 1999, the public was told only that the grand jury had decided not to indict anyone. This was the story that held for more than a decade, that the grand jury had examined the evidence and concluded there was not enough to charge anyone. But in 2013, the actual grand jury indictment was unsealed, revealing a secret that had been kept from the public for 14 years. The true bills returned by the grand jury were shocking in their implications, and in what they revealed about the disconnect between what the grand jury believed and what the district attorney chose to do with those beliefs. The grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder directly, but for child abuse resulting in death and for accessory to a crime. The specific language of the indictment stated that the Ramseys had permitted a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation that posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenét Ramsey. It also stated that they had rendered assistance to a person, knowing that person had committed the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death by helping such person avoid or delay prosecution. These charges suggested the grand jury believed the Ramseys knew who killed JonBenét and had helped cover it up, even if they had not committed the murder themselves. It suggested the grand jury believed someone in that house had killed JonBenét and that the parents had protected that person. But District Attorney Alex Hunter had refused to sign the indictment, stating publicly that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute the case successfully in court. Without the district attorney's signature, the indictment was essentially meaningless, a historical document that revealed what the grand jury believed, but that could not result in any criminal charges. The revelation of the grand jury's vote in 2013 reignited the entire controversy and raised profound questions about Hunter's decision. Why would a district attorney refuse to prosecute a case where a grand jury had found sufficient evidence to indict? Was Hunter protecting the Ramseys because of their wealth and social standing in Boulder? Was there genuinely insufficient evidence to win a conviction in court, despite what the grand jury believed? Did Hunter know something about the case that made prosecution impossible or inadvisable? Or was there something about the grand jury process itself that had led to a flawed conclusion? These questions have never been fully answered, and Hunter has defended his decision by pointing to the DNA evidence that excluded the Ramsey family and that suggested an intruder might have been responsible for JonBenét's murder. That DNA evidence would become increasingly important as time passed and as testing technology improved, ultimately leading to a formal exoneration of the Ramsey family that came far too late to repair the damage to their reputations and their lives. The DNA evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case became a battleground where competing theories of the crime clashed with scientific limitations and with questions about contamination, transfer, and interpretation. Unknown male DNA was found in JonBenét's underwear and under her fingernails. DNA that excluded every member of the Ramsey family when tested. DNA that has never matched anyone in any criminal database, despite being run through CODIS multiple times over the years. DNA that seemed to point definitively to an intruder, except for one persistent problem. The DNA was found on clothing rather than on JonBenét's body itself, raising questions about when it was deposited and whether it was necessarily related to the crime. Could the DNA have come from a factory worker who handled the underwear during manufacturing? Could it have been transferred innocently at some earlier time through touch or through secondary transfer? These questions created doubt about whether the DNA was actually evidence of an intruder or merely forensic noise that was unrelated to the murder. As DNA testing technology advanced, the samples were retested multiple times. Touch DNA technology, which can extract genetic material from the smallest amounts of biological material left by simple skin contact, was applied to various items of JonBenét's clothing. These tests found DNA consistent with the unknown male profile on the waistband of JonBenét's long underwear and in other locations, suggesting to some experts that this was indeed DNA from whoever handled JonBenét during the crime and not merely incidental contamination. But other experts remain skeptical, pointing out that touch DNA is particularly susceptible to contamination and transfer, and that finding it on clothing proves very little about when or how it got there. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey took the extraordinary step of sending a letter to the Ramsey family, formally apologizing for the suspicion they had endured and stating that the DNA evidence cleared them of involvement in their daughter's murder. Lacey's letter stated that the Boulder District Attorney's Office did not consider any member of the Ramsey family to be suspects in the case and that the evidence suggested someone outside the family had committed the crime. This exoneration was welcomed by the Ramsey family and by those who had always believed in their innocence. But it was criticized by many in law enforcement and forensic science, who felt that Lacey had overstepped her authority and had drawn conclusions from the DNA evidence that were not scientifically justified. The DNA evidence, they argued, was ambiguous at best and certainly did not definitively prove an intruder had committed the murder. But the exoneration stood, and from that point forward, the official position of the Boulder District Attorney's Office has been that the Ramsey family are not suspects and that the investigation is focused on identifying the unknown male whose DNA was found at the scene. Lou Smit entered the investigation in March 1997 as a legendary detective who had solved more than 200 cases during his career, many of them cold cases that had stumped other investigators for years. Smit had been retired, enjoying his post-career life, when the Boulder District Attorney's Office contacted him and asked him to help with the JonBenét Ramsey case. Smit agreed, believing his experience and his fresh perspective might help break through the stalemate that had already developed in the investigation. He began reviewing the evidence with no preconceptions about who was guilty or innocent, simply following what the physical evidence told him. And what it told him, he concluded, was that an intruder had committed this crime and that the Boulder Police Department's focus on the family was misguided and was preventing the real killer from being identified. Smit identified what he believed was clear evidence of how an intruder had entered the house through a basement window that showed signs of disturbance and that opened into a well where someone could have hidden while waiting for the house to quiet down for the night. He demonstrated that a person could fit through this window despite initial police conclusions that it was too small for an entry point. He pointed to a suitcase positioned directly under the window that could have been used as a step by someone climbing out. He identified marks on JonBenét's body that he believed came from a stun gun, suggesting the killer had used such a device to incapacitate her before assaulting and murdering her. He compiled evidence of an intruder scenario that he found compelling and that directly contradicted the theory the Boulder police had been pursuing. Smit's conclusions put him at odds with the police department, creating tension that eventually led to his resignation from the case. But he never stopped believing the Ramseys were innocent, and he never stopped working to identify the real killer, continuing to investigate on his own time and at his own expense for the rest of his life. Before Lou Smit died in 2010, he made his daughter Cindy promise that she would continue his work, that she would keep fighting for justice for JonBenét, that she would not let the case be forgotten or close with the wrong conclusion. Cindy Smit has honored that promise, working with other investigators and journalists who believe in her father's theory, keeping the intruder scenario alive in public discussion, and pushing for continued investigation into leads that might identify the unknown male whose DNA was found at the scene. The intruder theory gained additional credibility from evidence that was downplayed or dismissed during the initial investigation's focus on the family. Boulder had experienced a series of unsolved sexual assaults in the months before JonBenét's murder, cases where an unknown perpetrator had entered homes at night and attacked sleeping victims, cases that showed a pattern of behavior that some investigators believed could be connected to JonBenét's murder. None of these assaults had been solved, and the DNA from those cases was never conclusively compared to the DNA found in the JonBenét case in a way that might have identified or eliminated connections. The Ramseys had hosted multiple events at their home during the Christmas season, including a tour of homes event where strangers had walked through their house, potentially learning the layout, potentially seeing which room was JonBenét's, potentially selecting their target and planning their crime. John Ramsey's company had recently been very successful, and there had been publicity about his wealth, potentially making the family a target for someone looking to commit a kidnapping for ransom. The high-tech boot print found in the basement matched no one in the family and suggested someone had been in that part of the house who should not have been there. A rope was found in one of the bedrooms that did not belong to the family, and that had never been adequately explained. A baseball bat was found outside the house with fibers from the basement carpet on it, suggesting it might have been used as the weapon that caused JonBenét's skull fracture and then removed from the house, though this theory was never proven. These pieces of evidence, when taken together, created a picture that supporters of the intruder theory found convincing. A scenario where a predator had targeted JonBenét, had planned the crime in advance, had entered the house through the basement window while the family slept, had taken JonBenét from her room, had assaulted and killed her in the basement, and had then written the ransom note in an attempt to confuse the investigation and buy time for escape. Critics of this theory pointed out the improbabilities and inconsistencies. Why would an intruder spend time writing a lengthy ransom note after committing a murder? How could someone be in the house long enough to commit the crime, write the note, and escape without being heard by anyone? Why would they use materials from inside the house rather than bringing their own? Where did they hide while writing the note, given that it would have taken considerable time to compose 2.5 pages? But supporters of the intruder theory had answers to these questions, pointing to the large size of the house, to the fact that the Ramseys were sound sleepers, to the possibility that the note was written before the murder rather than after, to the psychological profile of certain types of offenders who insert themselves into investigations through such theatrical gestures. As 2026 begins and the 30th anniversary of JonBenét's murder arrives, there is renewed focus on the case and genuine hope that advances in forensic technology might finally provide the answers that have been so elusive for 3 decades. Genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years. using DNA from crime scenes to build family trees through public genealogy databases, and then working down those trees to identify potential suspects. This technique has solved dozens of cases that had been cold for decades, including the identification of the Golden State Killer and numerous other long unidentified perpetrators. The technology requires sufficient quantity and quality of DNA to upload to genealogy databases and to construct family trees. And there are questions about whether the DNA samples from the JonBenét case meet those requirements. There are also questions about contamination and about whether the DNA that was found is actually related to the crime or is merely incidental. Questions that affect how much resources should be devoted to pursuing genetic genealogy leads. But if the DNA is from the killer, if it is sufficient quality for genealogy analysis, if it can be uploaded to the right databases, and if those databases contain DNA from relatives of the killer, then genetic genealogy could potentially identify a suspect within months or even weeks. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, has been increasingly vocal in recent years about his belief that the Boulder Police Department has not done everything possible to pursue genetic genealogy and other advanced DNA testing options. He has given interviews to documentaries and news programs arguing that the police have been resistant to outside help, that they have not worked with all available labs and experts, that political considerations and a reluctance to admit past mistakes may be preventing them from pursuing the most promising leads. The Boulder Police Department has responded that the case remains an active investigation, that they continue to work with DNA experts and to pursue all available technologies, but they have released very few specific details about what testing has been done and what results have been obtained, citing the need to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. This lack of transparency has frustrated many who have followed the case, who wonder whether the public has a right to know more about the status of the investigation 3 decades after the crime, who question whether the police department's desire to control information might be harming rather than helping the pursuit of justice. Boulder Police Chief Maris Harold stated in 2022 that the department has committed to working with the Colorado Cold Case Review Team and with outside DNA experts, that they are exploring all available technologies and approaches, that solving this case remains a priority despite the passage of time. New DNA testing is being conducted on evidence that has been carefully preserved for decades, evidence that may yield results with current technology that were impossible to obtain when the evidence was first collected in 1996. There are persistent rumors in investigative circles that significant progress is being made, that genetic genealogy or other advanced testing may be close to identifying a viable suspect, that an arrest could potentially come in 2026 if these efforts bear fruit. But these rumors remain unconfirmed, and the Boulder Police Department has not made any official statements suggesting a breakthrough is imminent. The case remains officially open and unsolved, a designation that has held for 30 years despite countless hours of investigation, despite libraries full of evidence, despite the passionate efforts of detectives and prosecutors and journalists and amateur sleuths who have devoted years of their lives to seeking justice for JonBenét. Whether 2026 will be the year when that justice finally arrives remains to be seen, but the hope is there, fueled by technology that did not exist when this crime was committed, fueled by investigators who refuse to give up, fueled by a family that will never stop seeking answers. If you've been following this case, if you believe justice is still possible after 30 years, if you want to stay updated on any developments in this investigation, make sure to subscribe to this channel, drop your theories and thoughts in the comments below, and hit that like button to help spread awareness about JonBenét's case. The truth is somewhere in the evidence, in the DNA, in the details that have been preserved and protected for 3 decades, waiting for the right technology and the right questions to finally reveal who killed JonBenét Ramsey and why they have escaped justice for so long.